Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Bill, and I'm joined today by a very special co-host, our producer breaking the fourth wall, Chris. How are you, Chris?
Bill, I'm doing well.
Now, Chris, you have been behind the scenes making this podcast happen for the better part of 2 years now, and we finally let you come out of your little dungeon and experience light for the first time and actually participate on the conversation side. How does it feel?
I mean, I feel a little bit like Harry Potter when he gets to move into Dudley's bedroom, because
that's right.
Prior to this, you guys actually did have me in a closet underneath the stairs.
We did. We have a great staircase at Monotype headquarters, and there's a little room underneath it. And Chris has been in there for 2 years producing this podcast. And that's how you earn your stripes, honestly, in Monotype. Yeah. So anyway, we brought you out of this dungeon for a very specific reason, a very wonderful reason, Chris, because today you're going to introduce a guest that you interviewed, somebody who you brought to the podcast who has such an interesting story and background. And we had been trying to chase down this fellow for quite a while. So why don't you tell everybody about today's guest?
Yeah, Kent Yoshimura. He is a wily one. Love him. He is kind of like a multi-hyphenate is, I think, the word that you often hear. He does everything. And I wanted to have him come on the show because the way that he approaches his life seems to be kind of chasing lightning, if I could characterize it that way. There are people in this world, Bill, as I'm sure have met, where kismet is just kind of happening all the time with them. And I think he recognizes that. But he also takes advantage of that through hard work and dedication and blood, sweat, and tears. So when that moment happens, it's like he goes on a different journey. And it's just chapter after chapter where he explores a new part of a creative world. And I find that very inspiring every single time I get to hang out with him. And I really wanted the listeners to hear it because I think he is just a gem.
I cannot really articulate this point enough that Chris has been talking about getting Kent on this podcast since maybe 10 years before the podcast existed. He has brought up Kent's name over and over and over again as somebody, but Kent is an elusive artist, always out in the world. The murals that he builds and kind of the immersive experience that he builds, he is always somewhere crazy and wild, and his life is a really fascinating one to learn from. So, Chris, I'm happy that we brought you out of the shadows to do today's episode. I know the audience is going to take something really interesting from it. And it's kind of sad to me that we finally got Kent on the show, because I can't keep making fun of you for trying to get Kent on the show now. It's actually happened. It's come to fruition. So with no further ado, I would like to turn it back to you, Chris, and to Kent for today's episode of Creative Characters.
So here we go. Kent Yoshimura is a friend of mine. He's also a multimedia artist and a creative director and a martial artist and an entrepreneur. He's from LA. You're currently living in Las Vegas. You recently moved there. Mm-hmm. And I should say I met Kent through my partner, Rosie. Kent is the kind of person that when you meet him, you quickly learn that he's the kind of person who's lived many lives. And then each one of them has this kind of rich story, a sometimes crazy story. And I wanted to interview you for this podcast because I think that your multitude of creative pursuits is really kind of perfect for, what we explore on the podcast. And I just want other people to know all these things that you do, because I think they're fascinating.
I'm so stoked that you brought me onto this show, especially because we do end up having like fun conversations anyways, offline, and you know how to ask the right questions, So can I open the beer while we're recording?
I mean, I say, why not?
Is that like a taboo? And
it's a privately held company, I think.
Perfect.
I'm going to start with your early life. You grew up in Southern California. What was that like? What were your outside influences?
As a fellow Burbank native, to say the least. There's not much going on in Burbank, at least at that time. So there's this ability for me to, one, explore the backdrop of nature that we have, like these beautiful mountains, but also like my dad really wasn't around when I was growing up. So a lot of the time that I was spending was with my mom and a lot of these like somewhat like feminine influences. Because it was my sister, it was my mom, it was my like grandma that was like taking care of me. Mm-hmm. And I feel that allowed me to explore a lot more of an emotional context within myself, if that makes sense. And because I felt like I was such like a sensitive child growing up, my first passion that really changed who I was diving into martial arts and reading manga that had to do with martial arts and fighting. And
which, by the way, manga, for anybody who doesn't know, is just like this really rich graphic novel history culture that comes from Japan.
Yes. And exploring that and finding a way to almost, I say escape then, but it was more like to complement this life that I had without like a masculine figure in my life. So, I mean, Rosie could tell me how I was in high school. I was a little bit of a crazy ADD like child, like reactive to everything, but thankfully it all eased itself out.
Can I ask what your dad was doing at that time in your life?
Yeah. Oh, so like my dad's amazing. I absolutely love him. You know, my dad comes from Japan, grew up in a very poor household. And one of the reasons he came to America was to try to find success here, because he knew that if he was in Japan, he would kind of just continue this lineage of poverty. It took like a very long time for his company to find a certain level of success. I just remember every year growing up, I would see him slowly more and more as his company became bigger and bigger. But I also know, like talking to my dad now as an adult, that this was a decision he had to make for himself because that's what he believed would lead the family to be happy.
It was a calculated sacrifice.
It's a calculated sacrifice. Yeah. And I do think that there's a little bit of that, I guess, mentality in me as well that I've taken from my dad, where what does a calculated sacrifice mean, you know, in terms of everything I do?
Yeah, yeah. So you're growing up in your early years in Burbank, you're exploring martial arts, you're exploring manga. At this time in your early years before you start high school, are you doing anything artistic in terms of like illustration or drawing or painting or anything like that?
Oh yeah, I would be drawing all the time, these manga characters whenever I had a chance. And one day I like told my mom, I was like, you know, I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. And I remember my mom was just like, no, you're not. Like, oh, you know, the thing is like, she let me do whatever I want. At the end of the day, she did support it. But I do remember my mom tells me that story all the time because like I love drawing so much that, you know, she was like hesitant to give me crayons and like pencils and like have me pursue this art a little bit more. But, you know, if there's a will, there's a way. I think I just like, there's something in me that needs to create and do art, you know, and like use my hands in some capacity. So
were you taking art classes? Were you exploring that in a more formal setting?
Yeah, I had an art teacher in San Pedro that one of my best friends, Eric, was getting taught from. And so I was learning classical painting techniques. And that was, you know, one of my main extracurriculars outside of the martial arts. But I think that love for manga and that Japanese art style just never disappeared. There was a part of me that was constantly reading, constantly drawing while reading these manga, trying to recreate these. Those were like my master studies, you know, in many ways. Like I wasn't studying the Renaissance painters, but I was studying like the Kentaro Miuras of the world or like the Oda Ichiros of the world. And it's influenced me significantly.
Wow. That is really cool. That's such a different, it's almost just like a completely different medium in the sense that there's so much technique, there's so much skill involved, but it moves because it's frame by frame by frame because it's a story. And I just think that's really interesting.
It's almost like the ultimate art form in many ways, similar to how I look at film or animation, where it's this incredible craftsmanship that takes so long to really develop because you have to be legitimately a good artist, but you're also a master of storytelling. You're also a master of drama and character development and everything else that just comes together. And I personally don't really watch anime because I love developing the character voices in my head when I do read the manga. And I could also set my own pacing when I read it. But a really good manga artist understands that, I believe, and knows how to do it incredibly well. So it's a big reason I got into film and music and everything else because I do think like I wanted to complement I'm like psychoanalyzing myself right now, but like I want to like complement maybe just this love for graphic novels with everything else that I could use as a resource to build it out.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because you end up attending UC San Diego, where you didn't go into the arts. You actually studied neuroscience.
Yeah.
You have this background now of painting and illustration at San Diego. You're studying neuroscience. What drew you into that field?
So I was taking some of the art courses when I was at San Diego, but I wasn't falling in love with the culture that surrounded the art scene within like an educational setting. But what I did fall in love with was the nuanced systems that humans have to appreciate art or to do art. There's definitely evolutionary benefits to why all of us are attracted to certain patterns in nature that are aesthetically pleasing. But there's no evolutionary benefit to pushing your creativity to like its extreme. And that's like so fascinating to me.
Excuse my like oversimplification, but you're talking about this like itch that needs to be scratched by the artist. I need to draw. I need to paint. I need to make music because I love it. There's no other desire to do it other than to do it for myself.
Right. And also, art is the most human thing that you could possibly do. And even within this world of AI and everything, if you think that AI is going to kill art, then you've already given up on art. Because to me, the act of creating that itch that you're talking about is what makes art so absolutely beautiful. And you could depend on like, a computer and a neural network system to develop something creative for you. But at the end of the day, that's never going to stop me from creating what I want to create and then pushing the bounds of what I create. Because every time I do, I learn something new that I want to incorporate into the next piece and the next piece and the next piece, which is how these models are trained, I guess in some way. But,
right.
It's like, to me, that still is the most human thing about why I continue to create. And it's still not going to change my opinion of how I view art and how I want to personally create art.
So I imagine you were thinking about these things when you were studying neuroscience at UCSD.
Yeah, because I focused on cognitive science and neural networks actually, and like AI systems. So that was actually a big part of my major. It was cognitive science with an emphasis on neuroscience.
So then you're at UC San Diego, you're studying neuroscience, but at the same time, you are a competitive athlete in martial arts. You're doing Muay
Thai, judo, jiu-jitsu. I grew up doing karate, yeah. It developed into all these other things. Yeah, I trained with the Olympic judo team in Japan. Recently, I just went back to the Imperial Palace in Japan because I used to train with the Imperial Guards in Japan too. Every summer, just flying back there, staying in the dorms of Kyokushikan, which is one of the best judo schools in the world. Even in high school, I'd go from school to karate class and I was there till like 8 p.m. because that's usually when my parents work till, and then I'd go home and eat dinner. So it was like every day of the week, I still was training martial arts like constantly. And during the weekends too, because it was just I was so devoted to getting better and it was so fun. And then when college hit, my friend Jeremy, who lives in Singapore now, showed me the school where he was training out of. And I was like researching schools as well. And that eventually led me down a path of training with, Sensei Jin Izumi and training with Carlson Gracie Jr. for my jiu-jitsu, and then going out and training with Samat Payakaru, who's considered one of the greatest Muay Thai fighters of all time in Thailand, and like going out there and fighting in the stadiums, going to Japan and, training with Imperial Guards or training with the Olympic team at the Kodokan out there. One thing I am grateful for in college is I think I could have dove very deeply into martial arts and then just did the neuroscience on the side. But my roommate that eventually became one of my best friends at that time was an incredible musician. And that allowed me to explore my artistic and music side whenever I wasn't training or in school. Because I would come home and we'd just be jamming all the time. I was able to maintain that creative side because the friends that I cultivated through him and through the people outside of martial arts in school were all very creative people. And I guess there was just always like an inherent desire for me to always want to be hanging out with creative people or people that were pushing their minds beyond just the physical.
So then you get thrown in with these people and it creates this opportunity for play.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while yes, you're taking probably your neuroscience studies seriously, you're taking the training for your martial arts seriously, it seems like there's this element of play where you're playing as well. You're like jamming with your friends, playing music.
Yeah.
Well, you go on to explore that kind of creative side because you go to UCLA and you start studying film.
Yeah. So around my junior year, I kind of realized like how much more I enjoyed doing creative stuff. And I started filming movies with my friends. I started making music. I started getting really into editing. And there was a point where I realized like, wow, I really want to explore film. And one of the films that I made during that time with my sister actually ended up being, this official selection for the UCSD's film festival. And I leveraged that to go into UCLA,
Nice.
But then during that time, I was living at my friend Coleman's house, like at his parents' house, who were so gracious to let me stay there because I was so poor and like trying to make it. But I met my friend Najib, who's an incredible cello player who had this beautiful story to tell of his father, when he was 13, got killed by another 13-year-old in a very poor part of Texas. And Najib ultimately went on to become a cello player for the Texas Philharmonic, and music saved his life, while this other 13-year-old that carjacked and killed his father was the youngest person to go to prison for life under the governance of George Bush in Texas. And it was this redemption story in documentary format that we wanted to create. And we were working with Stefan Skarbek and Mirrorball Studios and trying to get funding. And we were very close to getting it because Stefan was really close with an artist named Amy Winehouse because he produced her album. And that same year that we were developing this documentary, making the teasers and everything, Amy Winehouse overdosed and died. That obviously derailed everything because, I decided not to continue my education in film because of how much it costs and everything. And I had to kind of reset my thinking to pursue something that would be more financially viable. So that's when I went back to, I think, my original skill set that I felt I was the best at, which was illustration. I started illustrating children's books and illustrating a children's book initially for Susan Chadakowitz, my friend Coleman's mom, who is a children's book author. So again, a very lucky situation that I'm living under the same roof with her, the same roof as her. So I could always be developing these children's books with her and illustrating for her. And then I found out this like method of identifying what children's book categories were the most underserved. And this is like over a decade ago. I was able to make like somewhat of a livable career off doing that. But it was also practice for me to be illustrating tens of children's books within like a course of 12 months.
Wow. So Kent is living in the spare bedroom of his friend Coleman's house, illustrating children's books that Coleman's mom, Susie, is writing. And then one day, Susie invites Kent to a party where he meets Mel Elias, who was at the time the CEO of the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. And this is where Kent's next chapter begins.
Susie was showing Mel Elias my work and the children's book work that we were doing together. And he was like, oh my God, I love this. I want to do a children's book and children's branding, and we need to launch like a children's line at Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. So I headed like the children's branding for the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf when I was like 25. And then Mel one day comes to me and is like, hey, I'm quitting the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. We're selling it. And I'm starting a music studio that's an affiliate of Sony so we can make music for film and television. Like, do you want to come with me to like start this thing? And so I was like, yeah, I wasn't even thinking about pay or anything at that time. The pay was terrible, but anyways, Mondo, Mel, me and this guy Wagner, who used to produce for like Steve Vai, Snoop Dogg, all these people, started this affiliate music studio called Wava Studios, which is how I got into working professionally in music for 2 years for film and television.
You're just kind of bouncing or skipping from one thing to another thing to another thing. There seems to be a certain element of kismet that's involved. You know somebody, you're at an event, you meet somebody else, these things happen. But are you also sort of following something or chasing something?
I think at some point in this pursuit for art, I realized that the best way to motivate myself to create any type of art and work, going back to like how my father works too, that like calculated sacrifice. For me to do art, I have to put myself into an employment position like of some sort and like sacrifice like my life for those next 4 years, just working my ass off. Those 2 years that I was working at a music studio was like accelerated production. I had to figure out how to compose and use these programs. When I was illustrating children's books, it was like an accelerated training course and illustrating every single day for like 10 hours a day to like make money. Like same with film, like the number of all-nighters. When I'm put into that setting, for better or worse, there's moments of like psychosis I go through where I really don't need to sleep for like 3 days straight because I'm just working. I'm sure you know this when you're editing and you just get lost in it and then it's the next day, but then you just do that again the next day. Like it's just, your brain just gets crazy motivated and gets tunnel vision. And the amount of times I did that is more than I could count. I get lost in the work. And I guess that goes back to like an artist needing to create, you know?
In those places, are there moments where you're stepping away because you realize you're too close to the work because you've been doing it for so long, you need to step away? Or is there like a critique process where someone else is like reviewing your work, you're taking notes and you're making those changes?
You know, now that I'm older, I'm a lot better at taking critique. But I think during that process, like when I get so tunnel visioned in, and I do think my superpower in many ways is my ability to just hone in and hyper focus on work and just get it done. But I think my biggest weakness is because during that time, and it's something I've worked through so like heavily over the last decade, but because I'm diving and do so much work, I tend to take control of projects too much. And relinquishing that control has made my life a lot better, first of all. Like I wish I learned how to do that earlier. But relinquishing that control has always made better product.
Illustrating for children's books, recording music for film and television, producing and editing documentaries. It might come as a shock to you, dear listener, that Kent creates a lot of things, including a few businesses. For example, in 2015, Kent teamed up with one of his closest friends, Ryan Chen, to launch Neuro, a company that makes gum and mints designed to boost energy and focus. One of their investors is 8-time Olympic medalist Apollo Ono. But honestly, are you even surprised? Another example, in 2018, Kent and his roommate at the time, who was a former Disney Imagineer, spent their savings to create Okie Dokie, a company that made immersive experiences at a time when things like the Museum of Ice Cream was all the rage. Okie Dokie saw a pretty sweet run of success. They built the first ever camp toy store in New York City, now a buzzing chain that combines toys and experiences for children and adults. Okie Dokie even received a direct request from P. Diddy to design his 50th birthday party. Unfortunately, during COVID, Okie Dokie, like many businesses, had to shutter its doors as the pandemic all but eliminated a market for humans being physically close to each other. No matter, Kent, the steadfast Swiss Army knife, had other irons in his fire.
My life is very random. It's very random.
Yeah. In a great way. I mean, you are a muralist.
Oh yeah, that's a big part of my identity.
Yeah. And I didn't know that when I first met you. And I think I realized it when I started following you on Instagram. And you did the walls for Warner Brothers Studio and you posted them up on Instagram. And I then got really into your murals. Like I started looking at all of them. And your murals can be seen in a lot of different places in Los Angeles. You do murals by commission for companies, businesses, big and small, like Warner Brothers and, mom and pop shops in Venice and stuff like that. But you also do murals for communities and like cultural locations. And I think just to start off is like, what got you into mural work?
So when I was at the music studio, I was getting very burnt out because, first of all, oh my God, the amount of immaturity that exists in that space was like getting too out of hand. But I want to get back into illustration because I think at the end of the day, the thing I loved the most was drawing and illustrating and putting my visual ideas on some surface. So one of the things that I was looking into was how can I bring back the physical strenuousness of like not sitting by a computer, but like being outdoors or being in like a very physically straining environment while also doing art. And, murals kind of seem like the most obvious thing for some reason, like to paint big. I didn't want to be hunched over by a computer drawing on a piece of paper or a tablet. I wanted to just be like out creating bigger and bigger work. And I mean, during that time too, I've already had one solo show and I had another one because, I was still making personal work and I was represented by this gallery in Chinatown. So I started looking for opportunities on any friend's walls or any walls that were available to start painting. One of the first murals I painted was in front of my friend Ryan McMahon's house. That mural doesn't exist anymore, but that kind of got me used to the wall. And I absolutely loved painting in a public space and having my work be exposed to the public. And from there, I went to this LA artist that's a lot older now, but he's been painting murals, but also has been designing stuff for people he designed the piano key suit for Elton John, for example. So he's kind of been in the scene. I went to this guy, Andrei Mirapolsky, and was like, hey, do you need an apprentice? I'm here if you need me. And he was like, oh my God. He always calls me like an angel. He's like, you're an angel. I need to paint this mural, but I'm too old. And so we get thrown into this mural in Pomona. I've never, the only mural I painted before that was this tiny wall in front of my friend's house. And that was my first experience managing him as an artist because, I love Andre, but his organizational skills are not the best. So I'm talking to the committee at the school while also getting scissor lifts, materials and everything. And then I go up there and me and him crank out this mural in 5 days at the School of Arts and Enterprise in Pomona. And the people in the community like it so much that they're like, Andre, we want you to paint this entire 3-story building, all 4 walls of it, on the outside. And it's called Pomonicopia. And that was my 3rd mural gig ever. I go out there. That was a crazy time. That was one of those times I pulled a 3-day all-nighter. I painted out in the sun in the Pomona heat, met one of my best friends and my mural partner now, Paul Juno. We paint this building, my name's on it. And during that time, while I'm managing this mural, I meet this lady, Lorraine Canales, who runs a school in Indian Hill. And it's like, oh, hey, we need a wall painted because we're an art school. So we want it to be creative and artsy. It's so crazy now to think about it. But she's like, I could offer you $500. And I go to Paul and I'm like, dude, do you want to paint this wall for $500? It's my first mural gig. He's like, yeah, man, I love painting. So we paint this wall, pull an all-nighter to finish it. Get paid $500. Materials probably cost $300. I paid Paul $150. So I made $50 on it. And that mural was the catalyst for me to get 5 more school murals back to back, literally every other month after that. And that ultimately led me down to a path of getting represented by this gallery, Giant Jai, who I was doing a solo show for, which at that time, LA City was trying to build a mural program. And I became one of the first, they chose a roster of 12 people. And I was one of the 12 people that LA City chose. And after 7 murals, I painted an 8,000 square foot mural in San Pedro. And that led me down the path of painting way bigger murals for cities and communities and everywhere else.
What is the biggest mural you've painted so far?
I painted one of the biggest murals in Shanghai, which is a 5-story building, all 4 walls within a staircase, including the bottom of the staircase. So that was pretty freaking big. In China, in August, the hottest time in Shanghai, with people who have no consideration of where they smoke, the people I hired to help me. So they're constantly smoking cigarettes in this closed off staircase. And I don't know how to speak Chinese. So I'm like, dude, you guys can't smoke cigarettes in here. We're working here. We're going to die. And it was so funny. So they'll be like, oh, they would just basically go 1 floor down from where I was and then start smoking again. And I'm like, oh my God. Anyways, that was a crazy mural. Yeah, took me 2 weeks to paint it.
One of the murals that I wanted to single out because I felt particularly moved by it is the work that you did in Little Tokyo, which is in downtown Los Angeles. You painted on the side of the Terasaki Budokan, which is this community center in Little Tokyo. And the title of that mural is To Catch the Moon. Can you Tell us about that project.
Yeah. So what's crazy is my art studio was in that building and they kicked me out of that art studio so they could build this community center. And it's funny because like my art studio had like 20 murals or something that Paul, me, Rooster, like all of our art buddies like painted inside this building. So all those got taken down and then this new mural To Catch the Moon came up. And what's also crazy is I moved art studios across the street from that building and that studio burned down completely. So I lost all my art. But in many ways, To Catch the Moon represented redemption. And it's one of the smallest murals I painted too, which is so funny that you like that one because I do love that one. It's one of my favorite pieces. But the color harmony, the message, I originally wanted to use actual footage from Manzanar. So I went to the Japanese American National Museum and looked through archives of photos of how people found peace and harmony in a place where they're technically at home, but they're not at home, to be completely taken away and still find peace within this sense of community. And Terasaki Budokan in many ways is this place where, first of all, anyone is allowed to go there to do sports, workout, anything. There's no fee whatsoever. It doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't even matter if you live on the streets. You are 100% allowed to go there because it is a community center. So I thought that was absolutely beautiful. So that's one. And then two is within the themes of like Manzanar and how even within the Japanese American internment camps, we were all able to find unity and peace within our communities. Felt incredibly valuable to me to express in this painting and in this mural. It just represented that journey.
That's wonderful. I loved it for the fact that this community came together to build this structure to house these services and opportunities for folks, like you said, just to go work out, to play sports, to connect, to create a cultural hub within, a city. And I think there is a kind of like a short video doc about the process, and you're talking over it, and you say that Los Angeles in a lot of ways is just a lot of gray.
Yeah.
This is just like this pop of color. The idea that there is something painted for the community on the actual building that houses things for the community is such a wonderful way, I think, to draw people's attention into something that's really important. And not every community in Los Angeles has that. And I think being able to see that in the hopes that it motivates more of that kind of thing in these communities.
One thing I wanted to say earlier is when I was represented by that gallery, I just felt so uncomfortable with all my pieces hanging inside a space where only select people could view them, and realistically select people of a higher social class. And that's the last time I ever painted gallery work, because there was a moment in there where I was, it was like my gallery opening, so my mind was all over the place. But there was a moment where I was like looking around and realizing like, oh my God, I love everyone here. Like, a lot of them are my friends, some of them like quote unquote collectors and people like brought in from the media and everything. But I wanted to create things in spaces that everyone can enjoy. And so much of my work, a lot of the community work I do, like, yeah, I have private client work, but even now, like, I take less and less of those every single year, because the murals I want to paint, I want them to be in public spaces, to be enjoyed by everyone, and to be a symbol for the community or a splash of color, like you said with the Terasaki Budokan mural, and to be able to at least ignite some emotion within like a space that's available for everyone. And that's become more and more important to me over the last few years with any of the mural works I do. And so I definitely paint way less murals because of that.
Yeah, but they mean more.
But they mean so much more. Every mural I've painted ever since I decided that has meant so much more to me.
I want to ask you about your Alaska mural, but before I get there, you'll even go so far as to paint on something that's not permanent. And what I mean by that is during the summer of 2020, you and your partner assembled like more than 50 volunteers to help paint on plywood that was put up to board up businesses during the Black Lives Matter marches. And of course, that was like a weekend affair that brought in a lot of people, probably some of whom didn't have any mural painting experience. And the outcome was just amazing. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was a celebration of cultural diversity. It was done in a very Kent style, but it also was not all you because you had all these other people contributing.
Yeah. When great creatives come together and not one person dictates it, beautiful things come out of that, And I think it was such a strong representation of that diversity because so many people from different walks of life brought their ideas and their painting styles to the table. And the only thing that I helped them do was teach them how to structure and paint a mural. After that, for the most part, I was kind of just an assistant. I was there to just fill in the lines for these people. Wow. It was awesome.
There's this playfulness that is on those murals, some of which I'm sure don't exist anymore or have been taken down. But in one that is permanent, or at the moment is permanent, is the one you did in Alaska.
Well, somewhat permanent.
Somewhat permanent, yeah.
The story around that is like, very fortunately, I got a call from the school district in the Bering Strait on an island called Yoshimura, which is sinking 11 square feet every single year. And they're going to be one of the first people, at least in North America, that are going to face a climate refugee crisis. So it's unfortunate because it's not getting the attention I feel like it should deserve. Because if we can't even save this small island, then how are we supposed to save ourselves when climate change is coming? And we need to be thoughtful of how much of a humanitarian disaster it may become if we don't get ahead of it.
Because it's happening now.
It's happening now. And when you go there and you see it and you see all the dead animals on the beach, I saw 2 dead whales. I've never seen a dead whale in my life. I saw 2 dead whales. And you see the people and you see like this island just getting scraped away by these waves that are so vicious in the way that it tears at the sand and erodes away at the cliffs. I mean, it was incredible. And I went up to paint a mural there, but I brought my friend Ken Honjo, who's an incredible video director and film director, to just document the process because I knew there was going to be something so much more when I found out about this project. And that's exactly what happened. You find out about the people, you find out about their culture, you find out about this background of this place. The Inupiaq people were nomads previously, but because of the US census laws, they were placed onto this island where they have no hope of escaping now. And to be able to paint the only mural that exists on this island, it was just like an incredible experience, not just to paint, but to get to understand people from different cloths more.
Yeah. What was it like when you were painting there?
Yeah. So we stayed in the school, actually, in one of the classrooms. So that was crazy. First of all, and I don't mean this in any bad way, but there's not much you can do when you're stuck on an island and there's only 500 people living on that island. And it's shrinking every single day, right? And you're kind of trapped there. They fly in their vegetables, they fly in their food, they fly out their garbage, or they burn their garbage there. And the sewage system is just honeypots everywhere. So the mural became kind of like a main attraction, which was in many ways our ability to find out more about these people, like the children that live there, which represent the future of this island that's inevitably sinking, to be in that environment and to see it all and to be creating art in that space was developed by talking with everyone. And it was developed by learning about their history and their culture.
It seems very much like an exchange point because you're there, you're an outsider, you are creating this piece of artwork, but in the process, you're learning about them and they're learning about you. And that has some real value.
Yeah, I mean, there's no dentist. There's one doctor that flies in once a month. Everyone doesn't eat vegetables. They tend to eat processed foods because that's the easier thing to ship in as well. It's like everything about destroying the culture that made these people is what's killing them. I think part of what we wanted to do was try to tell a story through filmmaking with this like 28-minute documentary that we made that we've been pushing out into film festivals. And thankfully, it's gotten a lot of recognition within that circuit. But in many ways, this is just a starting point to hopefully uncover the veil of the reality of the world out there.
So you have this history of doing like these murals and illustration and art and your business savviness and your dedication to studying something and like absorbing it and learning it and attempting to master it. And at some point, COVID happens, there's lockdown, we are all shut in, and you and your roommate decide you need an outlet. You need to do something to just scratch that itch. And what you end up coming up with in a very playful kind of way is to do a 20 or 30 minute remake of one of your favorite childhood action movies on the cheapest budget that you possibly can do. And the first one you did is Fast and Furious on a budget, brought to you by the Budget Boys.
Tom, I know you do criminal stuff. And you can tell me, because I'm not a cop. I want to be badass like you. I want in.
I'll tell you more at Race Wars.
Race wars?
For people who haven't seen this, you should go watch this, especially if you've watched Fast and Furious. What is Fast and Furious on a budget?
Oh my gosh, what is Fast and Furious on a budget? It was a need for my roommate Kevin and I to creatively express ourselves in a time where we were in a global moment of psychosis. And thankfully, our psychosis was realized by what we had available, which was our iPhones, a bunch of crappy little props that we had around us, plus very little money because Kevin was unemployed at the time because he was a dentist, funny enough. The funniest dentist you'll ever meet. And I wasn't painting murals because the world was locked down. So I couldn't go outside and like make half the income that I usually make. So COVID it was terrible for the world, don't get me wrong. But it was also this moment of peace and it was like breathing space in the chaos, I think, of our lives. And for Kevin and I, who both love movies, we were rewatching all of our favorites. And at some moment, we were like, let's pick up this project to try to recreate these movies in the cheapest way possible because we have no money. And Fast and Furious was the first one. We posted it on Reddit and it just blew up out of nowhere. And it's like a 25-minute film, mind you.
Yeah.
Like it's a real production.
And you and Kevin play all the parts.
We play all the parts.
In certain points, you swap the same wig. You like use a Sharpie to draw a mustache and cut it out. And then you tape it onto your face.
It was utilizing all my studies and time I've ever spent in editing. And Kevin's an incredible writer. And he was able to just distill all the best moments from Fast and Furious. And both of us just came together and we're like, all right, I know what a good shot kind of looks like. You know what a good shot kind of looks like. Let's do it.
So I have to say, for anybody who hasn't seen this, when you watch it, your first reaction might be, this is objectively terrible. But I assure you that on like further study, it is these things. You guys put so much intent into it that it isn't objectively terrible. You get all of the main plot points that you need to know what the movie is. It's like this beautiful Cliff Notes that is just a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was an incredible project.
Yeah.
It is Fast and Furious, shot by two people who live together on less than $100 budget. That's basically it. It's funny, we were talking about it. We were like, because people were like, what would you guys do? You know, we're a bunch of 30-something-year-olds. Like, what would you guys do if you didn't have to work? And Kevin and I were like, we'd probably do Budget Boys. We'd probably just make a lot of stupid clips. Like, that was the most fun I've ever had. I will say, for people who want to see something still objectively terrible, but a little bit better, because we learned from our first go around, go watch Men in Black on a budget, because we definitely got a lot better.
Yeah. I kind of want to close out with just a reflection on why I wanted to interview you for this podcast. Rosie, my partner, reminded me of this conversation we had probably during the pandemic when you came over for a bite to eat. You were just talking about how you've come to prioritize a life that brings you joy, and the decisions that you make are kind of led by your pursuit of like a joyful outcome or a joyful experience, even if it requires a lot of hard work and blood, sweat, and tears and pain and discomfort, that you're making this calculated sacrifice for joy, for something fulfilling. And sometimes you do that by juggling more than one project at a time. You're clearly like hardworking. And I guess my question here is like, you know, do you have to cultivate this kind of drive regularly, or does it come naturally? And if you have to cultivate it when you feel like you're running out, like where do you go to refill that?
I think there's this inherent drive as an artist for me to showcase the things that I create, for better or worse. When I do impulsively want to create something because I do believe it will bring either joy to myself or joy to the world, you get this tunnel vision to want to go out and make sure that thing is created so that people in the world can go out and enjoy it.
Well, we'll keep watching where you go next, because so many different lives you've lived so far, Ken. So I imagine only more to come.
Yeah.
It was great chatting with you. Thanks for
Yeah,
coming on.
thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you want to see more of Kent's work, the best place to view it is on the side of a building, because Kent has painted some amazing murals in Los Angeles and all over the world. But if you don't live near one of them, you can also see it and his other work, including his guerrilla public space work, on Instagram. His handle is @Kentaro, that's Kentaro, and his website is www.kents, that's Kents.world. As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. If you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It is produced by Christopher Olin, Mia Sullivan, and Marie Tabares. We will be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.